Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the mid-12th century, as the humiliated and psychologically shattered kings of the Second Crusade slunk back to their European domains, their royal reputations in tatters and their armies reduced to spectral remnants that bore no resemblance to the proud hosts that had marched east with such pomp and piety, the Latin states of the Holy Land briefly exhaled, imagining that the great storm had passed and that a period of recovery and consolidation was now at hand, a time to rebuild the shattered walls and replenish the depleted garrisons before the next inevitable crisis. The great army of Christendom, the largest and most prestigious military expedition that the medieval West had ever assembled, a force that had been preached into existence by the fiery eloquence of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and that had been led by the two most powerful monarchs of Europe, had been shattered in two separate but equally catastrophic disasters. Disasters that were not merely military defeats but were profound spiritual and psychological traumas that would haunt the conscience of Christendom for a generation. First on the frozen, blood-slicked slopes of Mount Cadmus in Anatolia, where the Templar discipline had been the only thing standing between King Louis VII of France and a Turkish scimitar, and then on the waterless, sun-baked plain east of Damascus, where the collective folly of the Crusader leadership had turned the siege of an allied city into a 4-day humiliation that broke the myth of Frankish invincibility forever. But the Kingdom of Jerusalem still stood, its borders battered and its treasury empty, its diplomatic alliances in ruins and its internal politics as fractious and self-destructive as ever, yet its great cities, Acre, Tyre, Caesarea, and the Holy City itself, the city that was the pulsing, sacred heart of the entire crusading enterprise, remained in Christian hands, guarded by the towering stone castles that the military orders were constructing along the frontiers with the immense wealth that flowed from the preceptories of Europe. The Templars and the Hospitallers, the warrior monks whose discipline and courage had been the only bright thread in the dark tapestry of the Crusade, had emerged from the disaster with their prestige towering over the disgraced feudal chivalry, their white mantles now the symbol of an unbreakable, monastic military professionalism that the secular lords could only envy and resent in equal measure. But while the Franks were counting their losses, tending their wounds, and engaging in the usual round of factional squabbling and mutual recrimination that was the permanent, incurable disease of the Latin kingdom, a far more profound and terrifying transformation was taking shape just beyond the horizon, in the ancient, walled city of Aleppo. A city whose history stretched back to the dawn of civilization, and whose rulers had always been among the most powerful and the most dangerous of the Muslim princes. There, a man of 40 years, lean and dark-bearded, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look through the flesh and into the soul of those he addressed, a man whose personal habits of austerity and devotion had already become the stuff of legend among his subjects, was constructing a new kind of Islamic polity. A state that would not merely raid the Crusader settlements for plunder and slaves but would systematically, ideologically, and militarily annihilate them. His name was Nur ad-Din Mahmud, the second son of the great conqueror Zengid, the man who had recaptured Edessa from the Franks and triggered the Second Crusade, and he was about to become the most dangerous and strategically sophisticated enemy the Templars had ever faced in their short, but already legendary history. The story of the Crusader kingdom's slow, inexorable march toward the horns of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem begins not with Saladin's birth, as popular history often assumes, but with Nur ad-Din's rise, a rise that was made possible, in the most bitter and tragic of ironies, by the very Crusader blunder that had destroyed the army of the Second Crusade, and that had handed the atabeg the ideological weapon he needed to unite the Muslim world. The betrayal of Damascus, the inexplicable decision to attack the Muslim ally Mu'in ad-Din Unr, had handed Nur ad-Din the ideological and political tools to unite Syria under a single banner, and he seized them with the cold, patient, calculating brilliance of a chess master who sees the endgame from the very first move, who understands that the true battle is won not on the field of combat but in the hearts and minds of the populations whose loyalty must be won. The political landscape of the Muslim Near East in the year 1148 was a shattered, fragmented mosaic of rival emirates, a landscape that had been the Crusader state's greatest strategic asset, each emirate ruled by a Turkish or Kurdish warlord who owed nominal allegiance to the distant Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad but who fought his neighbors with far more enthusiasm and frequency than he ever fought the Franks. Aleppo and Damascus, the two great Syrian powers whose rivalry had defined the politics of the region for a generation, had been locked in a cold war for decades, their mutual hostility a strategic gift of incalculable value to the Crusader states. Allowing the Latin kings to play one Muslim city against the other with the skill of seasoned diplomats who had learned the intricate art of Levantine politics through decades of hard experience. Mosul, the northern bastion on the banks of the Tigris, was an independent power center whose rulers looked eastward toward Persia as much as westward toward the Mediterranean, their interests often diverging from those of their Syrian cousins and their military resources frequently tied up in the endless wars of the Iranian plateau. The assassin sect, the mysterious and feared Nizari Ismailis, held a chain of impregnable mountain fortresses in the coastal highlands and pursued their own shadowy war of targeted killings and political manipulation, a wild card that any rational power had to calculate into its strategic equations and that had, on more than one occasion, altered the course of Near Eastern history through the sudden, violent death of a key political figure. Into this fractured, divided, endlessly quarrelsome world the First Crusade had erupted like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, and the very fragmentation of Islam, the inability of the Muslim princes to unite against the common enemy, had been the secret of the Frankish colony's survival against all demographic and geographic odds. A secret that the Crusaders themselves barely understood but that their most perceptive enemies were beginning to analyze with cold, clinical precision. Nur ad-Din, who had inherited the western half of his father's domains after the assassination of Zengid in 1146, understood this dynamic with a clarity, a depth, and a strategic sophistication that none of his predecessors had ever possessed, a sophistication that was the product of his unique combination of religious education, political experience, and a native intelligence that his contemporaries, both Muslim and Christian, recognized as something approaching genius. He saw, with the cold, analytical eye of a true statesman, that the military power of the Franks, their devastating heavy cavalry charge, their massive stone castles, their crossbowmen and their siege engines, could ultimately be overcome, but only if the political weakness of the Franks, the deep, structural division of the Muslim world, was first eliminated through a patient, long-term campaign of unification and ideological mobilization. His life's work, the great project that would consume every waking hour and every ounce of his formidable energy until his death in 1174, was the unification of Syria under a single, Sunni banner, and the ideological engine that would drive that unification, the fuel that would power the machine, would be the Jihad. The early life of Nur ad-Din had prepared him for this world historical role with an education and a formation that were remarkably rare among the Turkish warrior elite of the 12th century, an elite that was more accustomed to the rough life of the steppe and the camp than to the refined atmosphere of the Madrasa and the mosque. Born in 1118, the very same year that the Templar order was founded in Jerusalem by Hugh de Payens and his small band of 9 knights, he had grown up in the shadow of his father, Zengid, the fierce, brutal, indomitable conqueror who had recaptured the city of Edessa from the Franks in 1144. A victory that had sent a shockwave through Christendom and triggered the preaching of the Second Crusade by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. But where Zengid was a man of the sword, driven by raw, unrefined power and the coarse pleasures of the flesh, a ruler who terrorized his enemies and his own subordinates with equal, indiscriminate ferocity, Nur ad-Din was a man of the book as well as the sword. A prince whose education had been supervised by the finest minds of the age and whose personal library was said to contain more volumes than the libraries of many of the great mosques. He was a prince who had been schooled by the finest religious scholars of the age and who fasted, prayed, and recited the Quran with the intense, inward devotion of a Sufi mystic, a devotion that was not a mere performance for the benefit of the ulama but a deep, authentic, almost consuming fire that burned in the core of his being and that illuminated every decision, every campaign, and every policy of his reign. He was a Sunni Muslim of the Hanafi school, and his piety was not a political performance, not a mask worn for the benefit of the ulama and the populace, but a deep, authentic, almost consuming fire that burned in the core of his being and that illuminated every decision, every campaign, and every policy of his reign, a fire that his enemies would come to fear as much as they feared his armies. When his father was murdered by a Frankish slave in 1146, the young prince had been present at the scene, and the assassination, the sudden, violent death of the man who had been the center of his universe, had seared into his soul a permanent, unshakable, white-hot hatred of the Franks. He saw them not merely as political enemies to be managed and negotiated with, as so many Muslim rulers had done before him, but as the infidel defilers of the holy places, the enemies of God whose presence on the soil of Islam was an intolerable sacrilege that must be expunged, a pollution that could only be cleansed by the shedding of their blood and the destruction of their kingdom. This fusion of personal trauma, profound religious fervor, and cold, calculating strategic brilliance was the unique, explosive, and historically unprecedented compound that would make Nur ad-Din the most effective and dangerous Muslim leader since the arrival of the Crusaders, a figure who would reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of the Near East and whose influence would extend far beyond his own lifetime. Through his pupil Saladin and into the centuries that followed. The immediate aftermath of the Second Crusade's attack on Damascus in July 1148 was the moment of supreme opportunity that Nur ad-Din had been waiting for, the window of strategic possibility that his patient, far-sighted political calculus had anticipated and for which he had been quietly preparing since his accession to power in Aleppo. The atabeg of Damascus, Mu'in ad-Din Unur, had been the linchpin of the anti-Zengid coalition, the Muslim ruler who had forged a formal military alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem against the expansionist ambitions of Aleppo, a partnership that had included the cession of the strategic fortress of Banias and the coordination of military campaigns against the Zengid territories. The Crusader betrayal, the inexplicable, suicidal decision by the kings of France and Germany to attack the one Muslim power that had been their most reliable and loyal ally, shattered Unur's strategic position entirely, and humiliated him before the entire Islamic world in a way that no Zengid military victory could ever have achieved. A humiliation that was immediately and expertly exploited by the atabeg's propaganda machine. Nur ad-Din, who had marched a relief army south from Aleppo to come to the aid of Damascus, arrived too late to engage the Crusaders in battle but just in time to occupy the moral high ground with a brilliance that was nothing short of political genius. He had been the savior of the city, the prince who had answered the desperate call of his fellow Muslims while the Franks were proving, in the most public and undeniable possible way, that they could never be trusted to honor any treaty, any alliance, or any oath, a lesson that was not lost on the watching Muslim world and that would be repeated in 1,000 Friday sermons for years to come. The propaganda value of this moment was incalculable, and Nur ad-Din's diplomats, preachers, and court poets immediately began to exploit it with a coordinated, sophisticated campaign that circulated the story of the Frankish treachery across every mosque, every madrasa, and every public square in Syria. The unification of the Muslim world, which had been an abstract, distant dream for generations, was now a concrete, urgent political necessity, and Nur ad-Din, the man who had answered the call and saved the city, was the natural, divinely appointed leader of that unification, a leader whose legitimacy was written in the blood of the Frankish betrayal and the gratitude of the saved. The personality of Nur ad-Din, as it was recorded by the chroniclers of his court and by the historians who wrote in the decades after his death, was a strange, compelling, and deeply impressive mixture of ascetic humility and iron, unyielding, absolute authority. He dressed in simple, rough woolen garments that were indistinguishable from the clothing of the humblest religious scholar, refused to drink wine or to listen to the courtly music that was the staple entertainment of the Muslim courts, and personally wrote copies of the Quran that he distributed to the mosques of his realm as a gesture of personal devotion. A gesture that was witnessed by thousands and that became an essential part of the legend that surrounded his name. He was known to weep openly during the prayers of the night vigil, his tears a visible sign of the intense, inward spiritual life that he cultivated with the discipline of a Sufi master and that he demanded, by example rather than by decree, from his entire court. Yet this man of tears, this prince who fasted and prayed and gave alms in secret, was also a man of cold, unyielding steel, a commander who personally led his troops into the thickest of the fighting with a courage that bordered on the reckless, and who never hesitated for a single moment to execute a disloyal emir, a corrupt official, or a commander who had failed in his duty. A duality that fascinated and terrified his contemporaries in equal measure. His court at Aleppo was not a palace of sensual indulgence, of silken cushions and dancing girls and flowing wine, but a center of austere religious learning, where the qadis and the fuqaha, the judges and the jurists, debated the intricate law of the Jihad and drafted the treatises that would fire the hearts of the faithful and guide the policy of the state. Nur ad-Din's personal seal bore the inscription, "I ask God for nothing but His satisfaction and the safety of the Muslims," a motto that he repeated in his letters, his public addresses, and his private conversations until it became the defining slogan of his reign, a phrase that was inscribed on the walls of his madrasas and embroidered on the banners of his armies. The personality of the atabeg, this fusion of the mystic and the warrior, the ascetic and the commander, was the template upon which the later legend of Saladin would be consciously and deliberately modeled, and Saladin himself would repeatedly acknowledge his predecessor as the true architect of the Jihad. The condition of the Crusader states in the years immediately after the Second Crusade was a deceptive, fragile, and ultimately illusory stability that masked the deep, structural weaknesses that would eventually prove fatal, weaknesses that the Templars, with their cold, professional eye, could see with a terrible clarity, but that the secular leadership of the kingdom consistently failed to address. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Edessa and Tripoli still controlled a thin, coastal strip of territory stretching some 500 miles from the Taurus Mountains in the north to the Sinai Desert in the south, their borders guarded by the great stone castles that the military orders were constructing with the wealth that flowed from the preceptories of Europe. The economy, fueled by the pilgrimage trade and the commercial networks of the Italian maritime republics, had recovered sufficiently from the initial shock of the Crusades' failure to provide the revenues needed for the kingdom's defense, and the internal politics of the Latin states had settled into a tense, faction-ridden equilibrium that was, if not peaceful, at least temporarily stable. A stability that was more apparent than real. But beneath the surface, the strategic foundations of the Frankish presence in the Levant were crumbling with a slow, inexorable momentum that few of the Latin leaders had the vision to perceive, a momentum that was driven by the deep, structural contradictions of the Crusader enterprise. The demographic weakness, the tiny number of Latin settlers, perhaps 100,000 souls at most, ruling over a vast, resentful, and increasingly hostile population of native Christians, Muslims, and Jews, was a permanent, incurable vulnerability that no amount of castle building could remedy, a vulnerability that was baked into the very DNA of the Crusader states. The diplomatic isolation, the direct and foreseeable consequence of the Damascus betrayal, had stripped the kingdom of its Muslim allies and left it facing a hostile interior without the buffer states and the divided enemies that had been the secret of its early survival, a secret that was now lost forever. And now, in Aleppo, a new kind of Muslim power was rising, a power that was ideologically mobilized, strategically centralized, and militarily professional, a power that would test the Templar discipline to its absolute limits and that would, in the fullness of time, bring the entire Crusader edifice crashing down. The political and military inheritance that Nur ad-Din received from his father, the great and terrifying Zengid, was a mixed legacy of spectacular conquest and profound instability, a legacy that a lesser ruler would have squandered in the chaos of succession and civil war, as so many heirs of great conquerors had done before him. Zengid had been the first Muslim commander to recapture a major Crusader city, the fall of Edessa in 1144 sending a seismic shockwave through the entire edifice of Christendom, a psychological blow that had launched the Second Crusade and that had, for the first time since the Frankish conquest, demonstrated that the Latin hold on the holy places was not divinely guaranteed, that the infidel could be defeated and expelled. But Zengid had also been a man of terrifying, almost pathological cruelty, a ruler who mutilated his enemies, terrorized his own subordinates, and ruled by fear rather than by loyalty. And his assassination at the hands of a Frankish slave in 1146 had left his domains teetering on the very brink of a fratricidal civil war that would have destroyed everything he had built, and that would have been gleefully exploited by the watching Franks. The elder son, Saif ad-Din Ghazi, had seized Mosul and the eastern, Mesopotamian half of the Zengid realm, while Nur ad-Din, the younger son, took Aleppo and the western, Syrian territories, a division of the empire that could very easily have degenerated into a war of succession that would have shattered the Zengid state beyond repair and that would have handed the Crusaders a strategic gift of incalculable value. Nur ad-Din, however, displayed a political wisdom and a patient prudence that were remarkably mature for a man of only 28 years. He recognized his brother's seniority without resentment, sent him regular gifts and letters of respectful submission, and quietly, methodically consolidated his own authority in Aleppo while avoiding any open conflict with Mosul that would have opened a door for the Franks to exploit. This early political prudence, the willingness to subordinate immediate personal ambition to the long-term strategic goal of Muslim unity, was a defining hallmark of Nur ad-Din's entire reign and a characteristic that the Frankish chroniclers, raised on a culture of personal honor and immediate gratification, could neither understand nor counter. For it was a mode of political behavior that was entirely alien to their feudal worldview. He understood with a clarity that none of his contemporaries possessed that the Muslim world could not afford a civil war while the Franks still occupied the coast and defiled the holy places, and he was willing to wait, to bide his time, to accumulate power slowly and silently like water wearing away stone, until the moment was ripe for unification. The religious ideology that Nur ad-Din adopted as the foundational principle of his rule was a deliberate, calculated, and brilliantly executed revival of the concept of jihad, a concept that had been dormant, neglected, and almost forgotten in the Muslim world for centuries, buried under the comfortable routines of a settled, prosperous civilization that had lost the martial fervor of its early years. The early Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries had been driven by a spirit of religious expansion and martial fervor that had carried the armies of the Prophet from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Constantinople and the Pyrenees. But by the 12th century the Islamic world had become a settled, sophisticated, urban civilization, its rulers more interested in court poetry, architectural patronage, and the refined pleasures of the palace than in the austere demands of holy war. The arrival of the Crusaders, the fall of Jerusalem to the infidel Franks in 1099, and the subsequent establishment of the Latin states on the soil of Islam had been a trauma that the Islamic world had not yet fully processed, a shock that had produced temporary, localized outbursts of religious fervor and calls for vengeance but no sustained, organized, strategic response. A failure that Nur ad-Din was determined to rectify. Nur ad-Din set out to change this, to transform the jihad from a sporadic, individual impulse into a permanent, institutionalized, all-consuming state policy that would define the identity of his realm and the purpose of his rule, a policy that would be as central to his state as the feudal levy was to the Frankish kingdom. He commissioned the most respected religious scholars of Aleppo to write elaborate treatises on the virtues of the jihad, treatises that were copied by hand, distributed to the mosques and the madrasas of his entire realm, and read aloud in the public squares and the Friday sermons, the words sinking deep into the consciousness of the population and gradually, subtly reshaping their understanding of their own identity and their own obligations. He personally funded the construction of dozens of new religious schools, the Madrasas that would train a new generation of qadis, preachers, and jurists in the militant, anti-Frankish theology that he was systematically creating and propagating. He rebranded his state not as another mundane Turkish emirate among many, concerned only with the collection of taxes and the aggrandizement of its ruling family, but as the Dar al-Jihad, the house of the holy war, a polity whose entire purpose, whose entire reason for being, was the defense of the faith and the eventual, inevitable expulsion of the infidel from the lands of Islam. A rebranding that had profound political and psychological implications. The institutional machinery of Nur ad-Din's ideological revolution was the Madrasa system, a network of religious colleges that he constructed across the cities of Syria with the focused, intense zeal of a religious founder building a new civilization. The Madrasa, an institution that combined a mosque, a school, and a residential dormitory for students, was not a new invention in Islamic history, but Nur ad-Din transformed it from a pious, private foundation into a deliberate, coordinated instrument of state policy and ideological indoctrination. A transformation that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire subsequent history of the Near East. Each madrasa was endowed with extensive lands and revenues that made it financially independent of the fluctuations of royal patronage, and its curriculum was carefully, centrally designed to produce a cadre of religious professionals who were fiercely loyal to the atabeg personally and who preached his message of unified, uncompromising jihad from every pulpit in the realm. The students, the fuqaha and the mutafaqiha, were rigorously trained in the Hanafi school of Islamic law, the legal tradition that most closely aligned with the Turkish ruling elite of the Zengid state, and they were taught, from the first day of their studies to the last, that the war against the Franks was a fardine, an individual, non-negotiable obligation on every Muslim man and woman. Not merely a collective duty that could be delegated to the professional soldiers. The madrasas were not merely schools in the modern sense, they were propaganda factories of immense power and reach, their graduates fanning out across the cities and villages of Syria to preach the Friday sermons, to teach the children the basic principles of the faith, and to enforce the strict moral discipline that Nur ad-Din demanded as the essential precondition of divine favor and military victory. The most famous of these institutions was the Madrasa al-Halabiyya al-Kubra in Aleppo, a magnificent architectural complex that became the intellectual and ideological heart of the entire jihadist movement, its library filled with the precious books of the Holy War, and its classrooms echoing with the intense, passionate debates of the scholars who had come from every corner of the Islamic world to be part of this great awakening. The personal piety of Nur ad-Din was not a private, monastic devotion that he kept hidden from the eyes of his subjects but a public, political performance of immense power and calculated effect that was designed to model the ideal Islamic ruler for the entire population. He was a constant, visible attendee at the 5 daily public prayers, his forehead marked with the dark, permanent callus of the devout worshipper who prostrates himself repeatedly on the hard stones of the mosque floor, a mark that was known as the raisin, and that was a badge of honor among the pious, a visible sign of a life dedicated to the service of God. He held regular, open sessions of the Mazalim, the court of public grievances, where any subject, no matter how humble or powerless, could bring a complaint against the most powerful emir, the wealthiest merchant, or the highest official of the state, and he was known, with a consistency that astonished his contemporaries, to rule against his own closest officials in favor of the weak and the wronged. He abolished the non-canonical taxes that had oppressed the peasantry for generations, the mukus that the secular rulers had imposed in clear violation of Islamic law, and he returned the revenues of the state to the strict, canonical sources of taxation prescribed by the Quran, a reform that was as popular with the common people as it was displeasing to the tax-collecting elite. But that cemented his reputation as a ruler who placed the demands of the faith above the interests of the powerful. This personal asceticism and public justice, this visible commitment to the highest standards of Islamic governance, earned Nur ad-Din a reputation for genuine sanctity that spread far beyond the borders of his realm, traveling with the merchant caravans and the pilgrim convoys to the farthest corners of the Islamic world and attracting scholars, poets, and warriors from Persia, Iraq, and even distant Khorasan. The image of the pious, just ruler was a political weapon of extraordinary power in the war for the hearts and minds of the Muslim population, a weapon that no Frankish king, with his crown and his scepter and his feudal entourage, could ever hope to wield. The relationship between Nur ad-Din and the religious scholars, the ulama, was a carefully cultivated, symbiotic partnership that strengthened both the authority of the state and the influence of the faith, a marriage of convenience that was, in its own way, as important to the atabeg's project as his alliance with the Mamluk military elite. The atabeg gave the scholars the lavish patronage, the extensive endowments, the political protection, and the privileged access to the levers of power that they needed to construct their intellectual and institutional edifice, and the scholars, in their turn, gave the atabeg the indispensable religious legitimacy, the carefully crafted fatwas, and the powerful propaganda that he needed to mobilize the population for the long, grinding war against the Franks. The chief Qadi of Aleppo, the renowned jurist Ibn al-Khashab, was a close personal advisor to Nur ad-Din and a fiery, charismatic preacher of the Jihad, a man whose thundering sermons could rouse the entire population of the city to a frenzy of anti-Frankish passion and martial fervor within the space of a single Friday prayer. The partnership between the ruler and the ulama was not without its internal tensions and its moments of friction. The scholars, who were the self-appointed guardians of the sacred law, were often critical of the pragmatic compromises and the necessary violences that the brutal business of politics required, and they did not hesitate to remind the atabeg of his duties to God and to the community of the faithful. But Nur ad-Din was exceptionally skilled at managing these tensions, presenting himself not as the master of the scholars but as their humble servant, the executor of their legal judgments, the living sword of the Sharia who merely carried out what the sacred law demanded. This posture of studied humility, the voluntary submission of the warrior to the jurist, was a powerful, disarming political tactic that effectively co-opted the entire religious establishment into the machinery of the state, transforming potential critics into loyal servants of the jihadist cause. The military machine that Nur ad-Din constructed was the physical, visible instrument of his jihad, a professional, disciplined, and highly trained army that was a quantum leap beyond the tribal levies, the feudal contingents, and the temporary coalitions of the earlier Muslim period. The core of the army was the asker, the standing regiment of professional cavalry that was the permanent, salaried backbone of the Zengid military, composed of Turkish Mamluks, the elite slave soldiers who had been purchased as young boys from the steppes of Central Asia, converted to Sunni Islam, and trained from earliest childhood in the brutal, demanding arts of mounted warfare. These Mamluks were the absolute elite of the army, armored from head to toe in the finest chain mail that the smiths of Damascus could produce, armed with the powerful composite bow that could kill a Frankish knight at 200 paces, the long, heavy lance that could shatter a cavalry charge, and the curved Damascus steel saber that could shear through mail and bone with a single, terrible stroke. Their personal loyalty to the atabeg absolute and unquestionable, their skill in battle unmatched by any force in the entire region. Around this professional, standing corps, Nur ad-Din organized the auxiliary forces of the Turkoman tribes, the free, nomadic horse archers whose extraordinary mobility and almost supernatural speed made them the perfect instrument for the hit-and-run tactics, the ambushes, and the scorched earth raids that were the daily reality of the Syrian frontier war. The army was organized into precise, hierarchical squadrons of 10, 100, and 1,000, a system that allowed for rapid, precise communication and flawless coordination on the chaotic battlefield, a system that was the direct mirror image of the Templar organizational model. The strategic vision that guided Nur ad-Din's military campaigns was a cold, patient, meticulously calculated logic of encirclement and attrition that was the antithesis of the feudal Franks culture of the glorious, decisive charge, a culture that had been the undoing of so many Muslim armies in the past, and that the atabeg was determined to exploit. He did not seek a single, dramatic, climactic battle that would destroy the Franks in a single afternoon of blood and glory. He understood, with the hard-won wisdom of decades of frontier warfare, that the Crusader states were a fortified, garrisoned frontier that could not be stormed in a single, heroic assault but must be slowly, methodically, and inexorably strangled over the course of years and decades. His campaigns were designed with the specific, limited objectives of isolating the Frankish cities from each other, cutting the strategic roads that connected Jerusalem to Antioch and Tripoli, destroying the vulnerable agricultural hinterlands that fed the Crusader population and provided the economic surplus that funded the military orders, and picking off the outlying castles one by one, year by year, like a patient predator culling the weakest members of a herd. The Franks, with their undeniable superiority in heavy cavalry and in the techniques of siege warfare, could still win a pitched battle if the circumstances were exactly right, and they could still hold a great castle against a direct assault for months or even years. But they could not be everywhere at once with their limited, irreplaceable manpower, and they could not protect the endless, porous miles of frontier that the kingdom's impossible geography required them to defend. Nur ad-Din's strategy was to stretch the Frankish resources to the absolute breaking point, to force the Templars and the Hospitallers to defend 100 scattered castles with a handful of knights each, to turn the entire Crusader state into a vast, thinly spread garrison that was slowly, quietly starved of men, money, food, and ultimately, hope, a strategy that was as remorseless as it was effective. The annexation of Damascus, the pivotal event that transformed Nur ad-Din from a powerful but geographically limited regional emir into the undisputed master of all Syria, was a masterpiece of political pressure, economic blockade, and patiently manufactured consent that ranks among the most brilliantly executed bloodless conquests in the entire history of the medieval Near East. The city that had once been the Crusader kingdom's most reliable and strategically essential Muslim ally, the city that the Second Crusade had tried and so spectacularly failed to conquer in its 4-day catastrophe, fell into Nur ad-Din's hands not by the violence of storm and sack but by the slow, quiet, almost imperceptible erosion of its political and economic independence over the course of several years. A process that was as elegant as it was inexorable. After the death of the wily and respected Mu'in ad-Din Unur in 1149, the rulership of Damascus passed to his weak, ineffectual, and politically hapless son, Mujir ad-Din, a man who entirely lacked the diplomatic skills, the strategic vision, and the personal force of character necessary to navigate the treacherous, shark-infested waters between the competing powers of Aleppo and Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din, who had already stationed significant contingents of his own Aleppan troops in the countryside around Damascus under the carefully maintained pretense of protecting the city from a potential Frankish attack, began to tighten the noose with the slow, deliberate patience of a master strangler, a patience that was the hallmark of his entire political career. He married Unur's daughter, inserting his own Zengid bloodline directly into the Damascene succession and creating a dynastic claim that could be activated at the politically opportune moment, and he began, through his agents and his propaganda, to cultivate a powerful pro-Zengid faction within the city itself. This faction included the influential merchants who controlled the trade routes, the respected scholars who shaped public opinion, and the common people who had been terrified by the Frankish attack and who now looked to Aleppo for protection, a coalition of interests that spanned the entire social spectrum and that no local ruler could effectively resist. The final, almost anticlimactically peaceful surrender of Damascus in April 1154 was a quiet, orderly event that was, in its own understated way, far more impressive and far more politically significant than any dramatic military storming could ever have been. Nur ad-Din's army, which had been camped in the surrounding countryside for months, appeared before the walls of the ancient city. But the great gates were not barred against them, the defenders were not mustered on the ramparts, and the siege engines were not deployed, for the battle had already been won in the hearts of the city's inhabitants before a single arrow was loosed. The gates were opened from within by the members of the pro-Zengid faction, who had been carefully cultivated and who now acted on the secret instructions of the atabeg's agents. And the army of Aleppo entered Damascus not as a conquering horde bent on plunder and rapine but as a liberating force, its soldiers under the strictest, most explicit orders to commit no violence, no theft, and no disrespect to the citizens or their property. Mujir ad-Din, the last emir of the once proud Burid dynasty, was politely but firmly escorted from the city and given a comfortable, well-funded pension in the distant provincial town of Homs, a gilded, humiliating retirement that permanently removed him from the political stage without the messiness and the potential backlash of an execution. The great Umayyad Mosque, the spiritual and architectural heart of the city, was ritually purified and reconsecrated according to the strict Sunni rites, and the preachers of the mosque began, for the first time in the city's history, to include Nur ad-Din's name in the Friday Khutbah, the sermon that was the traditional, universally recognized symbol of sovereignty in the Islamic political tradition. The unification of Aleppo and Damascus, the two great, rival cities of Syria, was the strategic event that the Crusader states had always dreaded and that their entire diplomatic strategy had been designed to prevent, a unification that transformed the entire strategic calculus of the Near East. The response of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the catastrophic news of the unification of Syria under Nur ad-Din's single, iron rule was a complex, unhappy mixture of genuine alarm, political paralysis, and the old, fatal, self-deceptive hope that the Muslim unity would somehow fracture under its own internal contradictions before the full weight of the unified empire could be brought to bear against the Latin states. King Baldwin III, who was now a mature, battle-hardened, and capable ruler of 24 years, understood with perfect, cold clarity the strategic catastrophe that the fall of Damascus represented for the long-term survival of his kingdom, but he was effectively powerless to reverse the situation or to mount any meaningful military response, for the kingdom's resources were already stretched to their limits. The kingdom's army, still severely depleted from the catastrophic losses of the Second Crusade and still suffering from the chronic, structural shortage of knights and infantry that was the permanent condition of the Latin East, was no longer capable of mounting any kind of sustained offensive operation against a major Muslim city, and the internal politics of the Latin states were as fractious, as divided, and as consumed by petty, self-destructive squabbles as they had ever been. The barons of Jerusalem, the very same men whose insatiable greed and whose corrupt, short-sighted machinations had destroyed the crusade on the plain of Damascus, were now genuinely terrified of the consequences of their own actions. But their fear did not produce the unity of purpose and the subordination of private interest to the common good that the existential crisis demanded. A failure that would be repeated again and again in the tragic history of the Latin kingdom. The Templars, who had watched the slow, inexorable unification of Syria with a cold, professional, and increasingly desperate alarm, began to urgently, frantically fortify their great castles along the eastern frontier, the massive fortresses of Safed, Beaufort, and Croc as Chevaliers becoming the crucial, irreplaceable anchors of a defensive line that was far too thin and that stretched over far too many miles of hostile territory. The Battle of Anab, fought on the 29th of June in the year 1149, was the first, bloody, and terrifyingly clear demonstration of the new balance of power that the unification of Syria was in the process of creating, a battle that sent a shockwave of fear and mourning through every Latin court in the East and that announced, in the most unambiguous possible terms, that a new and far more dangerous era had begun. Raymond of Antioch, the handsome, charismatic, and fatally impulsive prince who had hosted the French King Louis VII and who had scandalized the entire crusade with his suspiciously intimate relationship to his niece, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, had launched a rash, ill-planned, and inadequately reconnoitered expedition into the territory of Aleppo, hoping to catch Nur ad-Din's army off guard and to win a quick, glorious victory that would restore the prestige of his principality. The atabeg, whose intelligence network was of a sophistication and a reach that the Franks could scarcely imagine, turned the tables on the Frankish prince with a speed and a precision that were nothing short of devastating, ambushing his army near the lake of Antiochia and annihilating it in a single, bloody afternoon of slaughter. Raymond himself, the greatest of the Crusader princes, the man who had been the living symbol of Frankish chivalry and the hero of 100 troubadour songs, was killed in the thick of the battle, his head severed from his body by the sword of the Kurdish general Shirkuh, his skull set in a silver casing and sent as a precious, honored trophy to the Abbasid Caliph in distant Baghdad. The death of Raymond of Antioch sent a shockwave of terror and grief through the entire Latin East, a sudden, gut-wrenching realization that the Muslims, who had once feared the legendary Frankish charge, were now actively hunting the Frankish princes like deer in the forest, and that no one, no matter how high-born or how powerful, was safe from the reach of the atabeg's armies. The diplomatic genius of Nur ad-Din, a quality that was perhaps even more important to his long-term success than his undeniable military skill, was his extraordinary ability to maintain an unrelenting, multi-front pressure on the Franks while simultaneously managing the incredibly complex, fractious, and often treacherous politics of the wider Islamic world. He was the ruler of a newly unified Syria, but he was also, at least in the formal theory of Islamic political hierarchy, a vassal of the Seljuk Sultan of Baghdad, and he was simultaneously the rival of his own brother Saif ad-Din Ghazi in Mosul and of the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, a Shia ruler whose theological legitimacy Nur ad-Din was determined to destroy. A complex web of relationships that required constant, delicate management. The atabeg navigated these competing, overlapping, and often contradictory loyalties with a diplomatic skill and a political finesse that none of his contemporaries, Muslim or Christian, could even approach, let alone match. He sent regular, respectful, and beautifully crafted letters and gifts to the Caliph in Baghdad, presenting himself not as a rival for power but as the humble, devoted servant of the commander of the faithful and requesting the caliphal diplomas and the formal, written investitures that legitimized his conquests in the eyes of the wider Sunni world. A diplomatic campaign that was as carefully planned as any military operation. He maintained a careful, publicly respectful, and privately watchful relationship with his brother Saif ad-Din Ghazi in Mosul, never directly challenging the borders of his brother's realm and always insisting, in every public statement and every official correspondence, on the fundamental, unbreakable unity of the Zengid family against the common Frankish enemy. This diplomatic dexterity, this ability to manage multiple, overlapping, and potentially explosive political relationships without becoming fatally entangled in any of them, was a skill that the Frankish kings, with their crude, binary, and deeply personal logic of feudal loyalty and feudal vengeance, could never master. And it was a skill that was as important to the atabeg's success as his most brilliant military victory. The cultural and intellectual transformation that Nur ad-Din sponsored and personally directed was, in the long-term strategic calculus, every bit as important to his great project as his military campaigns and his political machinations, for he understood, with a depth of insight that was rare among the rulers of any age, that the war against the Franks could not be won by the sword alone. That it must be won in the hearts, the minds, and the souls of the Muslim population before it could be won on the battlefield. The atabeg was the lavish, dedicated, and highly discriminating patron of an extraordinary, unprecedented flourishing of religious literature, devotional poetry, and monumental architecture, all of it carefully, consciously, and systematically oriented toward the single, unifying, and galvanizing theme of the jihad against the infidel occupiers of the holy places. The poets of his court, men of immense talent and deep religious conviction like Ibn al-Kaysirani and al-Arkam, composed elaborate, rhetorically sophisticated panegyrics that celebrated the atabeg as the divinely chosen champion of the faith and the terrible, irresistible scourge of the infidel. Their verses, painstakingly copied by teams of scribes, circulated across every city and town of Syria, and recited aloud in the public squares and the crowded souks, the words sinking into the collective memory of the population. The architectural projects that Nur ad-Din personally funded and supervised, the magnificent mosques, the charitable hospitals, the travelers' caravanserais, and the public baths, were not merely functional buildings designed to meet the practical needs of the population but were powerful, permanent, and highly visible statements of the strength, the piety, and the civilizational superiority of the new, unified Islamic state, statements that could be seen and touched and experienced by every subject. The great mosque of Aleppo was restored and dramatically expanded under his direct patronage, its towering minaret rising over the ancient city like a stone finger pointing inexorably toward heaven, its vast, serene courtyard filled with the students of the attached madrasa who had come from every corner of the Islamic world to study the sciences of the jihad. The public morale of the Muslim population, which had been deeply and traumatically battered by 50 long years of Frankish conquest, settlement, and the daily humiliations of living under the shadow of the Latin castles, was slowly, patiently, and methodically rebuilt by the sophisticated, multi-layered propaganda machine that Nur ad-Din had painstakingly created. A machine that operated on every level of society from the highest scholarly discourse to the simplest folk tale. The Friday sermons in the mosques, which were the single most important medium of mass communication in the 12th century Islamic world, were carefully coordinated across all the cities of Syria, the preachers delivering a remarkably consistent, centrally directed, and emotionally powerful message of jihad, unity, and the imminent, divinely guaranteed liberation of the holy places from the infidel defilement. The stories of Frankish atrocities, some of them entirely true, some of them creatively embellished for maximum emotional impact, and some of them outright fabrications designed for a specific political purpose, were systematically circulated as a means of stoking the righteous, purifying anger of the population, anger that could be channeled into the disciplined, purposeful violence of the jihad. The harrowing tales of Christian villages burned to the ground, of Muslim women sold into the slave markets of Europe, and of mosques desecrated and turned into churches formed a long, painful litany of grievance that welded the entire community together in a shared, burning desire for vengeance. The stories of Muslim victories, the glorious death of Raymond of Antioch at Anab, the successful ambushes against the Templar patrols, the heroic defense of this or that border fortress against the Frankish siege engines, were amplified, celebrated, and woven into the fabric of the official narrative, the victories presented as undeniable. Visible signs of God's renewed favor upon the faithful and of the turning of the great tide of history, a tide that was now flowing irresistibly in the Muslims' favor. The psychological effect of this sustained, sophisticated propaganda campaign was a slow, profound, and irreversible shift in the collective consciousness of the entire Syrian population, a shift that the Franks, with their cultural isolation and their lack of any comparable ideological apparatus, were entirely unable to counter. The unification of the Syrian interior under Nur ad-Din's single, unchallenged rule had immediate, devastating, and perfectly foreseeable consequences for the economic life of the Crusader states, consequences that were as damaging to the long-term survival of the Latin kingdom as any military defeat, for economic strangulation was a weapon that no castle wall could defend against. The great caravan routes that had once flowed freely and profitably between Damascus and the Frankish ports of the Mediterranean coast, bringing the precious silks, spices, damask steel, and exotic goods of the East to the hungry markets of Europe, were now deliberately diverted northward, away from the Latin kingdom and into the territories controlled by Aleppo and the other Muslim powers. The rich agricultural hinterlands of the Syrian interior, the fertile grain-growing plains of the Hauran and the Bekaa Valley that had once provided a significant portion of the food supply for the Frankish cities, were now firmly under Muslim control. And the surplus grain that had once been sold to the Crusader merchants was now carefully stockpiled in the granaries of the jihadist armies, or used to feed the growing population of the unified Syrian state. The Bedouin tribes, the nomadic shepherds, guides, and traders who had moved freely across the porous frontiers of the earlier period, were gradually, systematically brought under Nur ad-Din's political control through a combination of generous subsidies, strategic marriages, and the ever-present threat of military force, their legendary mobility, and their intimate, irreplaceable knowledge of the desert terrain, now a powerful weapon of the Muslim state. The Crusader economy, which had always been precariously dependent on the unpredictable flow of pilgrims from Europe and the commercial networks of the Italian merchant cities, was being slowly, inexorably strangled, its supply lines cut one by one, its markets shrinking, and its tax base eroding with every passing year, a process that was as remorseless as the desert sun. The Templars, who were by far the greatest institutional landowners in the Latin East, saw the revenues from their extensive Syrian estates decline alarmingly, even as the costs of maintaining and garrisoning their great network of castles continued to rise, a financial vice that was as effective as any military encirclement. The intelligence network that Nur ad-Din maintained was a weapon of war that was, in its own quiet, invisible way, as deadly and as decisive as his army of Turkish Mamluks, and it was a weapon that the Crusaders, with their rudimentary, ad hoc, and culturally isolated system of scouts and paid informers, could not possibly hope to match, for the atabeg had turned the entire Syrian population into a vast, living intelligence apparatus. The atabeg had recruited, trained, and deployed agents in every major Frankish city, from Jerusalem and Acre in the south to Antioch and Tripoli in the north, a shadow army of Syrian Christians who reported on the movements and the internal politics of the Latin armies, Muslim merchants who passed on the valuable gossip of the bazaars and the caravanserais, and even, it was persistently rumored and widely believed, disaffected or secretly bribed members of the military orders themselves who leaked the secrets of the Templar councils to the atabeg spymasters. The information that flowed in a constant, detailed, and remarkably accurate stream into Nur ad-Din's chancery in Aleppo was comprehensive in its scope and impressive in its precision, allowing him to anticipate Frankish campaigns before they were even formally launched and to position his own limited forces at the decisive points while the Crusaders, moving blindly through hostile territory, dispersed theirs. The Templars, whose internal security was legendary and who routinely executed suspected spies with a swift, ruthless efficiency, were repeatedly, frustratingly unable to plug the leaks that seemed to penetrate even their most closely guarded councils, a failure that was as damaging to their morale as it was to their operational security. The intelligence war was a war that the Muslims were winning decisively, and the deep, structural asymmetry of information between the two sides was a force multiplier of immense power that allowed Nur ad-Din to concentrate his forces with a precision that the Franks could neither understand nor replicate, a precision that was the product of years of patient, systematic work. The response of the Templar Order to the sudden and terrifying rise of Nur ad-Din as a unified, jihadist threat was a comprehensive, urgent, and strategically fundamental reassessment of the Order's entire role in the defense of the Holy Land, a reassessment that would reshape the Templar mission for the remaining century of the Order's existence. The Templars had been originally founded in 1119 as the humble protectors of the Pilgrim Roads, a small, mobile police force of 9 knights who escorted the vulnerable travelers from the port of Jaffa up through the dangerous mountain passes to the holy places of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The rise of a unified, ideologically mobilized, and militarily professional jihadist Syrian state fundamentally transformed the nature, the scale, and the intensity of the threat facing the Latin East, and the Order transformed itself in a correspondingly fundamental response to meet that new, existential challenge. The great castles, the massive, technologically sophisticated, concentrically designed fortresses that the Templars and the Hospitallers began to construct in the 1150s and 1160s, were the physical, visible, stone and mortar expression of this profound strategic transformation, a decisive shift from a mobile, offensive strategy of patrols and escorts to a static, defensive strategy of garrisoned fortresses designed to absorb the shock of the Muslim assault. The castle of Safed, built by the Templars on a commanding volcanic peak overlooking the entire Jordan Valley, was a masterpiece of the military architect's art, its walls an astonishing 30 feet thick in places, its vast, deep cisterns capable of holding enough water to sustain a garrison of 1,000 men for a full year of siege, its granaries stocked with sufficient provisions to outlast any besieging army. The Templars, who had once dreamed of conquering Aleppo and Damascus, were now pouring all their immense resources into building fortresses to survive the coming counterattack, a shift that was both a strategic necessity and a silent admission that the initiative had passed to the enemy. The internal politics of the Crusader states during the 1150s and 1160s, the two crucial decades of Nur ad-Din's consolidation and the unification of Syria, were a slow, grinding, and utterly self-destructive civil war that sapped the already limited strength of the Frankish colony even as the external threat from the unified Muslim interior grew with every passing year. The kingdom of Jerusalem was torn, almost from its very founding, between the faction of the native barons, the Pulani, who had been born in the Levant, who spoke Arabic, who understood the intricate local political landscape, and who had learned, through decades of hard experience, the arts of survival in a hostile environment, and the newcomers who arrived with all the arrogance of European courtiers. Opposing them were the newly arrived European Crusaders, who arrived periodically with fresh troops, fresh gold, and a fresh, unshakable contempt for the accommodations, the compromises, and the cultural hybridity that the Pulani had necessarily developed in order to survive. King Baldwin III, who had learned the brutal realities of statecraft in the crucible of the Damascus disaster and who had matured into a capable, intelligent, and pragmatic ruler, struggled heroically to hold the warring factions together and to maintain some semblance of a unified front against the gathering Muslim storm, a struggle that consumed his energy and his reign. His authority was constantly undermined by the very structure of the feudal kingdom, a structure that gave every independent baron the legal right to wage his own private wars and to pursue his own private diplomacies regardless of the broader interests of the crown. The Queen Mother, Melisende, who had been the real power behind the throne for decades and who was a woman of formidable political skill and iron determination, was forced into a bitter, humiliating, and very public conflict with her own son, a conflict that erupted into open, armed civil war in the streets of Jerusalem in 1152. A war that saw the holy places themselves become a battleground between Christian factions while the Muslim enemy watched and waited. The spectacle of the royal family of Jerusalem, the anointed guardians of the Holy Sepulchre, fighting each other with drawn swords while Nur ad-Din's armies gathered on the frontier, was a study in the self-destructive, almost suicidal folly that had become the tragic hallmark of the Crusader states. The military campaigns of the 1150s, the decade that followed the disaster of the Second Crusade and the shock of the unification of Aleppo and Damascus, were a continuous, grinding, and utterly exhausting frontier war, a season of endless raids, counter-raids, ambushes, and the slow, painful, incremental loss of territory to the steady, relentless Muslim advance, an advance that never stopped, never paused, and never gave the Franks a moment of respite. Nur ad-Din did not launch a single, dramatic, all-or-nothing offensive against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Instead, he applied a constant, unrelenting, and carefully calibrated pressure along the entire length of the frontier. His mobile light cavalry striking without warning at the vulnerable villages and the ripening harvests, his powerful siege engines methodically reducing the outlying castles one by one. The Franks, whose army was a traditional feudal levy that could only be legally mobilized for a strictly limited period of 40 days each year, were structurally unable to respond to every attack, to be everywhere at once, or to protect the endless, porous miles of frontier that the geography of the kingdom demanded, and every year the gap between what was needed and what was possible grew wider. The cumulative, compounding effect of the constant raiding was a slow, steady, and deeply debilitating bleeding of the kingdom's economic and demographic strength. The Templars and the Hospitallers, who maintained permanent, year-round garrisons in their great network of castles, bore the heaviest, most continuous brunt of the grinding frontier war, their knights and sergeants fighting 100 small, nameless, unrecorded battles in the rocky passes of the Jordan and the dusty plains of the Horan that never made it into the official chronicles but that claimed the lives of the order's finest brothers, a slow, steady hemorrhage of the best fighting men in the kingdom. The chronicles of the military orders are filled with the long, sad list of the dead, the brothers who fell in the endless, anonymous skirmishes that were the daily, unglamorous reality of the frontier, their sacrifices unrecorded in the great histories of the Crusades but absolutely essential to the survival of the kingdom. The personality of Nur ad-Din as a military commander was a study in the sharpest possible contrasts with the feudal chivalry that the Franks embodied, a contrast that goes to the very heart of the military culture clash that the Crusades represented, a clash between two fundamentally different ways of understanding and waging war. He was not a knight who fought for personal glory, for the admiration of his peers, or for the honor of his lineage. He was a general who fought for specific, achievable strategic objectives, and his undeniable personal courage was always, in every circumstance, subordinated to the iron, impersonal discipline of the army as a whole. He was known to have fought in the front ranks of his troops on numerous occasions, his simple, unadorned armor making him almost indistinguishable from his Mamluk bodyguards, but he was also known, with a cold, pragmatic wisdom that the Franks could never understand, to have withdrawn from a battle that was going badly, preserving his precious, irreplaceable army for a future campaign rather than dying in a futile, glorious, and strategically pointless last stand. This cold, pragmatic, ruthlessly professional approach to the business of war was the absolute antithesis of the Frankish chivalric ideal, the ideal of the knight who would rather die a glorious death than retreat from the field, the ideal that had been so brutally, catastrophically exposed on the waterless plain east of Damascus. Nur ad-Din's generalship was a continuous, patient, disciplined process of accumulating small, incremental advantages, avoiding all unnecessary risks, and waiting with the patience of a predator for the inevitable moment when the enemy would make a fatal mistake, a mistake that the atabeg's entire strategic system was designed to provoke and exploit. The Franks, who had been raised from childhood on the heroic romances of Roland and the chivalric epics of Charlemagne, simply could not comprehend an enemy who refused to play by the familiar rules of chivalry, who declined the open field battle and vanished into the mountains when the heavy cavalry charged. The Battle of Lake Hula in 1157 was a textbook example of Nur ad-Din's cold, patient military method and the Crusaders' fatal, seemingly incurable inability to learn from their repeated encounters with it. A battle that should have been a lesson but that was instead merely a prelude to greater disasters. King Baldwin III, leading a powerful force of Templar knights and secular cavalry, had marched confidently into the Jordan Valley to relieve a Muslim raid on the important frontier town of Banias, a fortress that had been ceded to the Franks by Damascus in the days when the two cities were allies. Nur ad-Din, whose network of scouts and spies had been tracking the Frankish column with meticulous precision from the moment it left its base, set a brilliantly conceived and perfectly executed ambush in the soft, marshy, treacherous ground near Lake Hula, a terrain that was ideally suited for his mobile light cavalry and utterly disastrous for the heavy Frankish horse. The Crusader army was caught in the classic, fatal trap, pinned between the impassable marshes on one side and the swarming Muslim horse archers on the other, the heavily armored knights sinking helplessly into the thick, sucking mud while the deadly arrows poured down upon them in a continuous, merciless storm, the battle a one-sided slaughter that cost the lives of hundreds of irreplaceable Templar knights and secular cavalrymen. King Baldwin himself narrowly escaped capture and the certain humiliating ransom that would have followed, his horse killed under him and his personal bodyguard overwhelmed and cut down, his survival a matter of sheer, blind chance and the desperate, suicidal courage of his remaining escort. The defeat at Lake Hula was not a strategic catastrophe in the sense of lost territory, but it was another devastating psychological blow to the already shaken confidence of the Frankish military. The diplomatic isolation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had been the direct, foreseeable, and entirely self-inflicted consequence of the catastrophic attack on Damascus, deepened and hardened with every passing year of Nur ad-Din's patient, skillful rule, an isolation that was as much the product of Frankish folly as it was of Muslim diplomacy. The Muslim emirs who had once been the rivals and the enemies of the Zengid dynasty, the independent sheikhs of the desert and the commanders of the assassin fortresses in the coastal mountains, were now either absorbed into the growing Zengid state through a combination of diplomacy, marriage, and military pressure, or they were cowed into a frightened, watchful silence by the demonstrated power of the atabeg's armies. The Byzantine Empire, the great Orthodox Christian power of the East that should have been the natural, indispensable ally of the Latin states against the common Muslim enemy, had been progressively alienated by the repeated failures and the insufferable arrogance of the Frankish princes. Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who had married his daughter to Baldwin III in a gesture of political alliance, was a fickle, self-interested, and deeply unreliable partner whose military support was never guaranteed and whose diplomatic loyalty shifted with every changing wind. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, who had been the essential financial, commercial, and naval backbone of the Crusader states since the earliest days of the Latin conquest, were increasingly distracted by their own intense commercial rivalries, their own endless wars in the Mediterranean, and their own lucrative trading relationships with the Muslim ports of Egypt and North Africa. Their commitment to the survival of the Latin kingdom dwindling to a bare, hard-bargained, commercial minimum. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had been founded and sustained by the international cooperation of all Christendom, was now fighting a desperate, lonely war of survival almost entirely alone. The expansion of Nur ad-Din's power into Egypt, the great prize of the Nile Valley that had been the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world since the time of the pharaohs, was the strategic masterstroke that transformed the already dangerous Muslim encirclement of the Crusader states from a partial, incomplete ring into a complete, suffocating, and ultimately fatal vice. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, the last surviving remnant of the great Shia empire that had once ruled the entire southern and eastern coast of the Mediterranean from Morocco to Syria, was in a state of advanced, terminal, and irreversible political decay, its caliphs mere ceremonial puppets who rarely left their gilded palaces. The real power contested violently among the competing viziers who fought each other for control of the rapidly shrinking government, a government that was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and incompetence. Egypt was, by any conceivable measure, the wealthiest, most populous, and most strategically vital territory in the entire region, the agricultural powerhouse whose annual Nile floods produced the grain surpluses that fed the populations of the entire eastern Mediterranean, and the commercial gateway to the fabulously lucrative trade of the Indian Ocean and the Far East. The control of Egypt, if it fell into the hands of Nur ad-Din and his jihadist state, would provide the atabeg with the economic resources, the demographic manpower, and the strategic depth that the small, beleaguered, resource-starved Frankish colony could never, under any conceivable circumstances, hope to match. And it would seal the fate of the Crusader kingdom with a finality that no amount of heroism could avert. The Crusader kingdom, now led by the astute, intelligent, and strategically minded King Amalric I, the brother and successor of Baldwin III, recognized the existential, mortal danger of a Muslim Egypt with a clarity that had been so sorely lacking in the earlier generation, and launched a series of ambitious, large-scale invasions of the Nile Valley in the 1160s. Attempting to seize control of the country before Nur ad-Din could consolidate his grip. The contest for Egypt became the central, defining theater of the entire war between the Franks and the Muslims, a great, multi-year, multi-campaign chess game of extraordinary complexity that would ultimately decide the fate of the entire Levant and that would consume the resources and the attention of both sides for the better part of a decade. The instrument of Nur ad-Din's Egyptian policy was the Kurdish general Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, a man of truly extraordinary military talent, fierce, unwavering personal loyalty to his master, and a deep, quietly burning personal ambition that would, in the fullness of time, shape the entire future of the Islamic world. Shirkuh, whose name in Arabic meant simply and appropriately, the lion, was a stocky, powerfully built warrior with a heavily scarred face, a single piercing eye that seemed to miss nothing, and a legendary personal courage in battle that was matched only by his equally legendary political cunning and his gift for the devious, intricate arts of court intrigue. A man who was as comfortable in the darkened corridors of the palace as he was on the blazing battlefield. Nur ad-Din dispatched Shirkuh to Egypt in 1164 with a small but superbly trained, highly disciplined, and fanatically loyal elite army, the mission being to intervene decisively in the chaotic internal politics of the Fatimid court, and above all, to prevent the Franks from establishing a permanent military protectorate over the Nile that would threaten the entire flank of the Zengid state. Shirkuh's campaigns in Egypt, which stretched over the next 5 years, were a series of brilliant, desperate, and audacious maneuvers, a war fought simultaneously in the burning western desert, on the broad, muddy waters of the Nile, and in the darkened, conspiratorial alleys of Cairo itself, against a constantly shifting, treacherously unstable coalition of Fatimid viziers, Frankish crusaders, and local Egyptian factions whose loyalties shifted with every changing wind and every whispered promise of gold or power. The Franks, led by the personally brave and strategically astute King Amalric I, fought a determined, parallel campaign for control of the Nile, their heavy cavalry slogging through the thick, clinging mud of the delta while the Templar fleet, the naval arm of the warrior monks, attempted to blockade the Egyptian ports and prevent the arrival of reinforcements from Syria. The contest for Egypt was a grinding, exhausting war of attrition that stretched the resources and the will of both the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Zengid state to their absolute limits. A war that neither side could afford to lose and that neither side seemed able to win. A stalemate that was as costly as any defeat. The role of the young Saladin, the nephew of Shirkuh, in the long, complex, and ultimately decisive Egyptian campaigns was, at the beginning, a relatively minor, subordinate, and unremarkable one, but the intense, multifaceted experience he gained in those crucial years was the indispensable foundation of his future greatness and his world historical career. Saladin, whose full and formal Arabic name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a Kurd of the Ayyubid clan, a young man of approximately 30 years who had been educated in the finest Madrasas of Damascus and who had served with distinction in the chancery of Nur ad-Din, mastering the intricate arts of administration and diplomacy, before being reluctantly, almost unwillingly, dragged into the brutal, bloody world of military campaigning by his forceful and domineering uncle. He was not, at this early stage of his career, a warrior of any particular distinction, nor did he display any of the obvious, flamboyant marks of the natural military genius. He was, by inclination and by training, a scholar, a diplomat, and a meticulous administrator, his greatest skills lying in the patient, unglamorous arts of government and negotiation rather than in the dramatic, visible arts of the sword. The Egyptian campaigns of the 1160s were Saladin's harsh, unforgiving, and profoundly formative military education, a brutal, hands-on, sink-or-swim training in the hard realities of war, politics, logistics, and the delicate, dangerous management of a complex, multi-ethnic, and often mutinous army, an education that would transform the scholar into a soldier and the diplomat into a conqueror. He learned from his uncle Shirkuh the essential arts of high command, the absolute, non-negotiable importance of logistics and supply, the subtle manipulation of the enemy's expectations and the exploitation of his internal divisions, and the careful, patient, long-term cultivation of political allies and the isolation of political enemies. The Saladin who would later become the great, immortal nemesis of the Crusaders, the conqueror of Jerusalem and the revered hero of the entire Islamic world, was forged, tempered, and sharpened in the white-hot crucible of the Egyptian wars, a product of the military-political machine that Nur ad-Din had constructed and that would now, in the person of Saladin, continue the master's work. The final, decisive turn of the long, bitterly contested Egyptian struggle came in the year 1169, when Shirkuh, after a series of brilliant, audacious, and brilliantly executed campaigns that had outmaneuvered both the Franks and the Fatimid viziers Shawwar at every turn, finally managed to enter the great city of Cairo as the de facto ruler of all Egypt. The Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid, a powerless, isolated figurehead who spent his days in the seclusion of his magnificent, decaying palace, was utterly powerless to resist the arrival of the Zengid army, and Shirkuh was formally appointed to the office of vizier, the effective prime minister and military dictator of the entire Fatimid kingdom, a position that gave him total, unchallenged control over the vast resources of the Nile. The Franks, who had fought so hard and sacrificed so much to prevent exactly this outcome, were forced to recognize the reality of their strategic defeat, retreating to their waiting ships and sailing back to the ports of Palestine, the great prize of Egypt lost to them forever. Shirkuh's triumphant moment, however, was to be tragically, ironically brief. The old Kurdish general, his powerful body worn out and exhausted by the decades of hard campaigning and the endless, stressful intrigues of the Egyptian court, died suddenly and unexpectedly of a surfeit of rich food, a massive heart attack or a similar sudden physical collapse, only 2 months after his great victory. A reminder of the fragility of all human ambitions. The succession to the all-powerful vizierate fell, by a combination of careful political maneuvering, the support of the Kurdish military faction, and a healthy dose of sheer luck, to his nephew Saladin, a man who had been a relatively minor, background figure in the campaign but who now, suddenly and dramatically, found himself the undisputed ruler of Egypt. The sophisticated ideological machinery that Nur ad-Din had so painstakingly constructed and so brilliantly operated in Syria over the course of 2 decades was now deployed, with the same meticulous attention to detail and the same strategic clarity, to consolidate the new conquest of Egypt and to permanently integrate the vast, wealthy, and strategically crucial Nile Valley into the fabric of the jihadist state. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had been the great, enduring ideological rival of the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad for over 2 centuries, the Shia counter-caliphate that had challenged the very legitimacy of the Sunni political order, was formally and ceremonially abolished in the year 1171. An event of immense theological and political significance that sent shockwaves through the entire Islamic world and that marked the end of an era that had lasted for more than 200 years. The Friday prayers in the ancient, hallowed mosques of Cairo, the city that had been the capital of the Shia Caliphate for 200 years, were said for the first time in 2 centuries in the name of the distant Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, a symbolic act that signaled the end of the great religious schism that had divided the Islamic world and the restoration of the theoretical unity of the Sunni Ummah. The abolition of the Fatimid Caliphate was a theological and political revolution of the first magnitude, the peaceful, almost bloodless end of the deepest and most enduring division within Islam, and it was achieved not by a single dramatic, violent act but by a patient, careful, multi-year campaign of religious propaganda, political pressure, and the systematic replacement of Shia officials and institutions with their Sunni counterparts, a campaign that was the direct continuation of the methods that Nur ad-Din had perfected in Syria. The Madrasas system of Egypt, the network of religious colleges that had been dominated for generations by the Shia doctrine of the Fatimids, was rapidly, thoroughly, and irreversibly transformed, the new, orthodox Sunni schools being founded and lavishly endowed in all the major cities of the Nile, the preachers trained in the strict, militant, jihadist theology that Nur ad-Din had pioneered in Syria. The strategic vice that the unification of Syria and Egypt created, the nightmare of total, suffocating encirclement that the Crusader states had dreaded for decades, was now a terrifying, inescapable, and mathematically certain reality, a reality that the Franks could no longer ignore or wish away. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once faced a convenient, manageable collection of fragmented, mutually hostile, and easily manipulated Muslim emirates, was now surrounded on every single side by a single, unified, ideologically mobilized, and militarily formidable empire. To the north, the great twin cities of Aleppo and Damascus, the two capitals of the vast Zengid state, controlled the entire Syrian interior, their powerful, well-trained armies positioned to strike at any moment at the vulnerable principality of Antioch and the isolated county of Tripoli, a threat that hung over the northern Crusader states like a sword suspended by a single, fraying thread. To the east, the great string of castles that the Templars and the Hospitallers had constructed at such immense cost faced a solid, unbroken hostile frontier, the constant, exhausting raiding of the Muslim light cavalry a daily, grinding pressure that drained the precious manpower and the fragile morale of the garrisons with a slow, steady, irresistible force. To the south, the new province of Egypt, now under the firm, capable rule of Saladin as the loyal viceroy of Nur ad-Din, provided the jihadist state with an apparently inexhaustible reservoir of agricultural wealth, a vast population of potential recruits, and most dangerously of all, a strategic base that could launch a full-scale invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the soft, relatively undefended underbelly of the Sinai Desert, an invasion route that the Franks had always known existed, but had never had the resources to adequately guard. The Crusader states were a thin, vulnerable coastal strip of territory, less than 100 miles wide at its widest point, surrounded on all sides by a unified Muslim empire that stretched, in an unbroken arc, for thousands of miles in every direction. The Templar response to the terrifying, unprecedented, and apparently hopeless strategic encirclement was a desperate, disciplined, and profoundly determined preparation for the final, apocalyptic storm that every brother in the Order now knew was coming, a storm that would test the Order's discipline and courage to the absolute breaking point and beyond. The Order, which had begun its existence as the humble guardian of the pilgrim roads, had now evolved, under the relentless, unforgiving pressure of the strategic environment, into the guardian of the entire eastern frontier of Christendom, its great network of castles and its small, elite force of knights the only truly reliable line of defense against the rising Muslim tide. The Templar rule, the ancient, sacred code that governed every aspect of the life of a brother of the Order, and which had always emphasized the absolute, unquestioning obedience of the individual to the collective, was now interpreted in its most extreme, ascetic, and demanding sense, the brothers preparing themselves, through intensified prayer, fasting, and military drill, for a war that they understood, with a cold, professional, and unsentimental clarity, would be a war of annihilation, from which no quarter could be expected. The recruitment of new knights, which had been a steady, reliable stream from the pious noble houses of Europe for decades, increased dramatically as the alarming news of the Muslim unification and the encirclement of the holy places spread across the courts and the castles of Christendom, the young men of the feudal aristocracy flocking to the white mantle of the temple in a desperate, belated, and tragically inadequate attempt to save the Holy Sepulchre from the gathering storm. The immense financial resources of the Order, the vast, complex network of preceptories and the sophisticated international banking system that had been built over the generations on the foundation of the original loans to the French crown at Mount Cadmus, were now mobilized to their fullest possible extent for the urgent, all-consuming work of reinforcing the castles and supplying the garrisons of the Levant. The complex, emotionally charged, and politically fraught relationship between Nur ad-Din and Saladin, the aging, increasingly suspicious master and the brilliant, ambitious, and increasingly independent pupil, was a bond of genuine loyalty, simmering tension, and growing mutual suspicion that was entirely typical of the intricate, personalistic political culture of the Zengid state. Saladin, who had been raised from his youth in the service of the atabeg and who owed his entire career and his current exalted position to the patronage of his master, was deeply, sincerely conscious of his immense personal and political debt to Nur ad-Din, and he publicly, repeatedly, and with every appearance of genuine humility acknowledged the atabeg as his lord, his benefactor, and the true, original architect of the Jihad. Yet the hard, unyielding realities of political power, the immense physical distance and the weeks of communication time between Damascus and Cairo, and the natural, almost inevitable ambition of a brilliant, successful, and charismatic young ruler who had tasted the heady wine of supreme authority were all slowly, inexorably, and perhaps irresistibly driving a wedge between the two men. Saladin, who was the effective, day-to-day ruler of Egypt in all but the formal title, began to pursue his own increasingly independent foreign policy, conquering the distant territories of the Sudan and Yemen and carefully building a separate, autonomous power base that was loyal to him personally and that was distinct from the traditional structures of the Zengid state. A power base that would one day be the foundation of his own empire. Nur ad-Din, who was now aging, increasingly ill, and growing more suspicious and irascible with each passing year, watched the meteoric rise of his former pupil with a cold, calculating, and deeply mistrustful eye, and began, in the final years of his life, to prepare for a major military expedition to Egypt. The final, profound, and deeply tragic irony of the relationship between Nur ad-Din and Saladin, an irony that would shape the entire subsequent history of the Crusades, was that the death of the master, which occurred in the spring of 1174, removed the only remaining obstacle to the pupil's complete and uncontested unification of the entire jihadist empire. Nur ad-Din died in his beloved Damascus on the 15th of May in the year 1174, at the relatively young age of 56, succumbing to a severe fever that had been dangerously aggravated by his lifelong habits of ascetic self-denial, his refusal to rest or to take the medical care that his exhausted body needed, and the immense, unrelenting pressures of a quarter-century of rule. He died in his famously simple, unadorned palace, surrounded not by the silken cushions and the beautiful concubines of a typical Muslim ruler but by the stern, bearded religious scholars and the hardened Mamluk officers who had been the two pillars of his extraordinary reign, his last recorded words a quiet, sincere prayer for the safety and the victory of the Muslim community, and a final, urgent command to his young son, Al-Salih Ismail, to continue the sacred work of the Jihad. The death of the great atabeg was the immediate signal for the rapid, chaotic, and entirely predictable disintegration of the delicate political order he had constructed, as the rival emirs, the ambitious generals, and the competing cities of Syria all jockeyed violently for power in the sudden vacuum, and the young Al-Salih Ismail, a child of only 11 years, was utterly incapable of imposing his authority on the fractious, power-hungry adults who surrounded him. Saladin, who had been watching and waiting in Cairo, immediately marched his battle-hardened Egyptian army into Syria, presenting himself publicly and repeatedly as the loyal, devoted servant of the Zengid dynasty. The legacy of Nur ad-Din, the immense, multifaceted, and world-historical inheritance that he bequeathed to his reluctant and ultimately usurping pupil Saladin and to the entire Islamic world, was a complete, fully functioning, battle-tested, and ideologically mobilized jihadist state, a fearsome machine of war and faith that was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful and the most sophisticated political entity in the entire Mediterranean basin. The atabeg had, through a quarter-century of patient, relentless, and brilliantly executed labor, successfully unified the long-divided and mutually hostile cities of Syria under a single, unchallenged authority, abolished the ancient and deeply entrenched Fatimid schism that had divided the Islamic world for 2 centuries, built a vast network of hundreds of madrasas and mosques that blanketed the entire region and that produced a steady stream of ideologically committed cadres, and trained and equipped a professional, disciplined, and superbly led standing army that was the acknowledged equal, and in many respects the superior, of any military force in Christendom. The ideology of jihad, which had been a dormant, neglected, and almost forgotten concept when he came to power, had been spectacularly revived, thoroughly institutionalized, and effectively disseminated to every city, every village, and every social class in the entire Muslim Near East, the preachers and the poets of Nur ad-Din's state having succeeded, over the course of a generation, in creating a durable, self-sustaining, and self-replicating culture of holy war. The strategic encirclement of the Crusader states, the great geographic vice that had been the atabeg's diplomatic and military masterwork, was now complete and absolute, the Kingdom of Jerusalem surrounded on every side by a hostile, unified, and resource-rich empire that was merely waiting for the opportune moment and the right commander to deliver the final, annihilating blow. The Saladin who conquered Jerusalem in the cataclysmic year of 1187 was not, as popular history often imagines, a self-made genius who rose from nothing by the sheer force of his own talent. He was, in the most profound and literal sense, the heir of Nur ad-Din, the executor of a grand strategy that had been devised and patiently implemented over the course of a quarter of a century of unremitting labor. The reaction of the Latin chroniclers to the rise of Nur ad-Din and to the terrifying, unprecedented strategic threat that he represented was a complex, uncomfortable, and deeply revealing mixture of grudging, unwilling admiration and profound theological and psychological confusion, a confusion that reflected the deep cognitive dissonance that the atabeg provoked in the minds of his Christian enemies. The Frankish writers, the monks and the clerics who composed the official histories of the Latin kingdom, had been trained from their earliest education to see the Muslims as barbaric, idolatrous, and culturally inferior pagans, the enemies of God whose military successes could only be explained by the sins of the Christians or the temporary, mysterious permission of divine providence. Yet now they were confronted, in the person of Nur ad-Din, with a Muslim ruler who was manifestly, undeniably, and publicly pious, just, merciful, and civilized, a man whose personal conduct, whose commitment to learning, and whose devotion to the principles of his faith put the squabbling, corrupt, and often scandalously irreligious Christian princes of Outremer to the deepest possible shame. A shame that the chroniclers could not entirely conceal. William of Tyre, the greatest, the most perceptive, and the most intellectually honest of the Crusader historians, described Nur ad-Din in his monumental chronicle as a man of great justice, a fierce persecutor of the Christian name, but a prince of truly remarkable courage, wisdom, and personal piety. A carefully worded backhanded compliment that perfectly reflected the deep cognitive dissonance that the atabeg provoked in the minds of his Christian enemies. The Templars, whose own institutional discipline and whose own austere, monastic piety mirrored, in a strange, unsettling, and inverted way, the discipline and the piety of the Muslim enemy they fought, had a much clearer, harder, and more professional assessment of the atabeg. They saw him, with the cold, unsentimental eye of the professional soldier, as the greatest and most dangerous strategic threat the Crusader states had ever faced, a commander who could not be bribed, could not be divided, and could not be provoked into a foolish, reckless battle. The psychological transformation of the Muslim world, the deep, profound, and historically decisive shift from a defensive, demoralized, and passively suffering posture to an offensive, confident, and aggressively triumphalist one, was perhaps the most enduring and the most consequential legacy of Nur ad-Din's entire remarkable reign. The Muslims who had lived through the catastrophic shock of the First Crusade, the horrifying fall of Jerusalem in 1099 with its terrible massacre of the entire civilian population, and the subsequent establishment and consolidation of the Latin states on the soil of Islam, had been, for 2 full generations, a deeply traumatized, profoundly humiliated, and spiritually disoriented people. Their traditional faith in the protection and the favor of God severely shaken by the apparently endless series of disasters that had befallen them. The unification of Syria, the spectacular revival of the long-dormant ideology of Jihad, and the steady, accumulating series of military victories that Nur ad-Din had so carefully orchestrated had slowly, patiently, and methodically healed that deep, festering trauma and had rebuilt the shattered collective self-confidence of the Muslim community. The Muslim population of the Near East, which had for decades hidden fearfully behind the protective walls of its cities and paid humiliating tribute to the Frankish lords, now marched out boldly to meet the enemy in the open field, their hearts filled with a new, burning, and unshakable confidence that God was, after a long and mysterious absence, once again on their side. The preachers in the mosques, the poets in the courts, and the scholars in the Madrasas had succeeded, over the course of a single, transformative generation, in creating a powerful new Muslim collective identity, an identity that was defined by the sacred, non-negotiable struggle against the infidel occupiers, an identity that was militant, united, triumphalist. and increasingly intolerant of any accommodation or compromise. The failure of the Crusader states to respond effectively, strategically, and in a timely manner to the rise of Nur ad-Din was a complex, multi-layered, and ultimately fatal failure of political leadership, military adaptation, and deep, structural cultural understanding. The kings of Jerusalem, Baldwin III and Amalric I, were both capable, intelligent, personally courageous, and reasonably effective rulers by the admittedly low standards of the feudal monarchy, but they were trapped, like flies in amber, in a rigid, archaic political system that gave them tragically insufficient authority over the fractious, independent, and endlessly quarrelsome barons and over the autonomous, self-governing military orders who were, in theory, their vassals. The Templars and the Hospitallers, who were by far the most effective, the most disciplined, and the most reliable military forces in the entire kingdom, were often at bitter, paralyzing odds with each other and with the crown, their own institutional priorities, their own international networks, and their own fiercely defended autonomy sometimes diverging significantly from the immediate strategic needs of the kingdom. The European monarchs, who possessed the immense resources and the vast manpower reserves necessary to mount a new, decisive crusade that could have broken the Muslim encirclement, were chronically, hopelessly distracted by their own endless wars, their own dynastic rivalries, and their own internal political struggles, the great, consuming Angevin Capetian conflict in France draining the energies and the treasuries of the West. The cultural gap between the Franks and the Muslims, the profound, seemingly unbridgeable inability of the Latin settlers to understand the language, the religion, the social customs, and the political dynamics of the people they ruled, was a permanent, structural, and ultimately fatal weakness that the Muslims exploited with devastating effectiveness. A weakness that no amount of military valor could compensate for. The Templar Order, which had first emerged into the full light of history as the savior of the French King Louis VII on the frozen, blood-soaked slopes of Mount Cadmus and which had been founded, less than 30 years earlier, as the humble, unarmed protector of the pilgrim roads, now found itself, in the darkening age of Nur ad-Din's encirclement, transformed by the relentless pressure of events into the permanent, professional, standing army of the entire Crusader enterprise. The secular feudal levies, the traditional, legally mandated military service of the knights and the barons of the kingdom, which had always been the theoretical backbone of the Frankish military system, were becoming increasingly unreliable, increasingly short in their terms of service, and increasingly incapable of meeting the professional standards of the new, total war that the Muslim unification demanded. The military orders, the temple and the hospital, were now, by default and by necessity, the only fighting forces in the entire Latin East that could be absolutely counted on to garrison the far-flung castles year-round, to patrol the dangerous, porous frontiers, and to fight the continuous, grinding, unglamorous war of attrition that was the exhausting, never-ending daily reality of the Crusader states. This fundamental transformation, the progressive militarization of the entire Crusader defense under the white mantles of the warrior monks, was an absolute strategic necessity for the survival of the kingdom, but it was also, in the longer term, a deeply dangerous political development that carried within it the seeds of future disaster. For it concentrated immense power in the hands of institutions that were beyond the effective control of the crown. The orders, which were international, supranational institutions that answered, in the final analysis, only to the distant Pope in Rome, were rapidly becoming independent states within the state, their immense accumulated wealth, their great networks of impregnable castles, and their private, professional armies a growing challenge to the already weakened authority of the crown. The Templars, who had once been the humble, self-effacing protectors of the pilgrim roads, were now, by any objective measure, the single most powerful and the most influential institution in the entire Crusader kingdom, a transformation that was as remarkable as it was, in retrospect, ominous. The great castles of the Templars, the massive, concentrically designed, and technologically sophisticated fortresses that still dominate the landscapes of modern Syria, Israel, and Jordan, were the permanent, physical, stone and mortar monuments to the age of Nur ad-Din and to the desperate, defensive transformation that the atabeg's strategic genius had forced upon the Crusader states. The castle of Safed, perched commandingly on a volcanic peak high in the mountains of Galilee, was a fortress of genuinely terrifying strength and sophistication, its outer walls an astonishing 30 feet thick in places and constructed of immense, precisely cut limestone blocks, its vast, deep cisterns capable of holding sufficient water to sustain a garrison of 1,000 fighting men for an entire year of continuous siege. Its granaries and its underground storage magazines stocked with enough provisions to outlast any besieging army that the Muslim world could throw against it, a fortress that was a testament to the desperate determination of the Templar order to hold the line at any cost. The castle of Beaufort, the hauntingly beautiful, beautiful fortress that guarded the strategic upper Jordan Valley and the approaches to the Litani River, was a dark labyrinth of underground galleries, hidden posterns, and secret escape tunnels, a fortress specifically designed to be held by a tiny handful of determined knights against an entire army for months or even years. The castle of Chastelet, the ill-fated and tragically short-lived fortress constructed at the strategic ford of Jacob's River on the upper Jordan, was a bold, audacious, and ultimately desperate attempt to physically block the main Muslim invasion route across the Jordan, a castle that was built in a frantic 6 months of feverish labor, and that was destroyed, after a brief but heroic siege, in the space of a single, catastrophic year by Saladin's sappers and miners, a poignant symbol of the losing battle that the Franks were fighting against the tide of history. These castles were not the romantic, soaring, fairy tale fortresses of the troubadour's imagination, with their beautiful damsels and their chivalric tournaments. They were grim, functional, brutally efficient killing machines, their every architectural feature designed with a single, cold purpose. The day-to-day life of the Templar garrisons in the darkening age of Nur ad-Din's encirclement was a life of strict monastic routine, constant, nerve-jangling vigilance, and the slow, grinding, morale-sapping attrition of the endless frontier war, a life that was as far removed from the glamorous image of chivalry as it was possible to be. The brothers rose before the first grey light of dawn for the first of the canonical prayers, the solemn office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, their low, rhythmic voices echoing in the cold, vaulted stone chapels of the castles while the sergeants and the squires prepared the weapons and the armor for the coming day, and the sentries on the wind-swept towers kept their weary, red-rimmed eyes fixed on the distant horizon for the telltale dust clouds that signaled the approach of the Muslim raiders. The long, monotonous day was meticulously divided according to the ancient rhythm of the rule into the 7 canonical hours of prayer, the hours of intense, repetitive military exercises and weapons drill, the hours of the endless, tedious, but absolutely essential tasks of garrison life, the constant repair and strengthening of the walls, the cleaning of the precious cisterns, the inspection and the rotation of the grain supplies in the granaries. The brothers ate their simple, silent meals in the communal refectory, listening in complete, enforced silence to the reading of the rule and to the edifying accounts of the order's glorious history, the inspiring stories of the martyrs who had died in the defense of the holy places. The night was a long, dark time of constant, watchful, and exhausting anxiety, the sentries walking the walls with their heavy crossbows cocked and ready, the patrols moving silently through the dangerous darkness of the surrounding hills, the sleep of the entire garrison always light, always restless, always ready to be shattered in an instant by the sudden, screaming alarm of a night attack. The Templar casualties in the long, grinding war of attrition against Nur ad-Din were a slow, steady, and deeply alarming hemorrhage of the order's finest, most experienced, and most irreplaceable knights and sergeants, a hemorrhage that the distant preceptories of Europe, despite their best and most urgent efforts, struggled desperately to replace. The frontier war of the 1150s and 1160s was not a war of great, decisive, history-making battles that filled the pages of the chronicles. It was a war of endless, nameless ambushes and skirmishes, of patrols that went out at dawn and simply never returned, their fate unknown and their bodies unrecovered. Of isolated castles that held out heroically for months and then finally fell to the overwhelming numbers of the besiegers, their entire garrisons massacred or sold into lifelong slavery, their names forgotten but their sacrifice recorded in the ledgers of the order. The names of the dead, the brothers who had fallen in the defense of this or that forgotten, nameless pass, were dutifully recorded in the order's great necrologies and were prayed for in the daily masses, their souls commended to the infinite mercy of God and their mortal remains buried in the crowded, ever-expanding cemeteries that surrounded the castles. The recruitment of new brothers, which had been a steady, manageable stream in the early, heroic decades of the order, became an increasingly urgent, desperate, and all-consuming necessity, the preceptories of Europe being ordered to send every available knight, every trained sergeant, and every spare coin of silver to the hungry, consuming, insatiable war in the East. A war that was devouring the Order's best men faster than they could be replaced. The Templar rule, which had been originally designed for a small, elite, and intimately connected order of a few hundred carefully selected knights, was being stretched to its absolute organizational limits to accommodate a vast, sprawling, international institution of thousands of brothers. The conquest of Egypt by Saladin, the final, decisive, and strategically cataclysmic step in the complete encirclement of the Crusader states, was an event that the Templars, who had been intimately and painfully involved in the failed Frankish attempts to prevent it, watched with a cold, clear, and utterly despairing professional clarity. The order had been deeply, directly involved in the ambitious Egyptian campaigns of the 1160s, its finest knights fighting alongside King Amalric in the mud of the Delta, its powerful fleet of galleys and transport vessels blockading the ports of the Nile, and its Grand Master Bertrand de Blancfort had been one of the most vocal and the most persuasive advocates for the entire Frankish invasion of Egypt. An invasion that had come so close to success and that had ultimately failed through a combination of bad luck, internal dissension, and the strategic genius of the Zengid commanders. The failure of the Egyptian campaigns, the final, humiliating withdrawal of the Frankish army, and the subsequent consolidation of Saladin's unchallenged power in Cairo was a strategic defeat of the very first magnitude, a defeat that the Templars had seen coming with a terrible, helpless clarity but had been powerless, despite their best efforts, to prevent. The unification of Syria and Egypt, the permanent, irreversible fusion of the interior and the Nile, was the single event that made the eventual, total destruction of the Crusader states a mathematical certainty, and the Templars, who were the grim, unsentimental military mathematicians of the Latin East, could read the final, fatal equation with a terrible, precise, and ice-cold clarity that left no room for hope or self-deception. The long war against Nur ad-Din had been a war of grinding, exhausting attrition. The coming war against Saladin, the war that was now clearly and unavoidably on the horizon, would be a war of total, merciless annihilation, and the Templars were the only force remaining in the entire kingdom that was fully prepared, psychologically, militarily, and spiritually, for the final, apocalyptic battle. The death of Nur ad-Din in the spring of 1174 and the subsequent, rapid, and brilliantly opportunistic rise of Saladin to the sole, unchallenged mastery of the entire Muslim empire was a transition that the Templars, who had been studying their enemies with the cold, analytical eye of the professional soldier for decades, had long anticipated and had, in their own strange, inverted way, deeply respected, for they recognized in Saladin a commander who combined all the dangerous qualities of his master with a charisma and a flexibility that were entirely his own. The old atabeg had been a known, familiar, and therefore in some sense predictable enemy, a commander whose strategic methods, whose tactical preferences, and whose political calculations had been painfully learned and internalized through decades of hard, direct experience. Saladin was an unknown, and unpredictable, and therefore a profoundly dangerous new quantity, a ruler who combined the intense, burning ideological fervor of Nur ad-Din with a dazzling personal charisma, a remarkable political flexibility, and a gift for the grand, dramatic gesture that the older, more austere man had never possessed or desired. A combination that made him far more dangerous to the Franks than his master had ever been. The Templar High Command, now led by the forceful, aggressive, and controversial Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, assessed the new Sultan with a wary, calculating, and professionally respectful eye, recognizing immediately that the vast Muslim empire, which had been held together for a generation by the sheer iron will and the personal sanctity of Nur ad-Din, was now being held together by the brilliant, ambitious, and potentially far more dangerous will of his successor. The war that was coming, the great, final war that would decide the earthly fate of the holy city of Jerusalem, was shaping up to be a war between the two most effective, the most disciplined, and the most ideologically committed military institutions of the entire age, the Templar Order and the Ayyubid army, and the outcome of that war would determine the fate of the holy places for centuries to come. The internal politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the critical years after Nur ad-Din's death were a vertiginous, sickening, and apparently irreversible descent into a chaos of faction, disease, and open civil war that the Templars, who were themselves increasingly drawn into the toxic maelstrom, watched with a mounting, helpless, and deeply frustrated fury. The conquest of Egypt by Saladin, the final, decisive, and strategically cataclysmic step in the complete encirclement of the Crusader states, was an event that the Templars, who had been intimately and painfully involved in the failed Frankish attempts to prevent it, watched with a cold, clear, and utterly despairing professional clarity. The order had been deeply, directly involved in the ambitious Egyptian campaigns of the 1160s, its finest knights fighting alongside King Amalric in the mud of the Delta, its powerful fleet of galleys and transport vessels blockading the ports of the Nile, and its Grand Master Bertrand de Blancfort had been one of the most vocal and the most persuasive advocates for the entire Frankish invasion of Egypt. An invasion that had come so close to success and that had ultimately failed through a combination of bad luck, internal dissension, and the strategic genius of the Zengid commanders. The failure of the Egyptian campaigns, the final, humiliating withdrawal of the Frankish army, and the subsequent consolidation of Saladin's unchallenged power in Cairo was a strategic defeat of the very first magnitude, a defeat that the Templars had seen coming with a terrible, helpless clarity but had been powerless, despite their best efforts, to prevent. The unification of Syria and Egypt, the permanent, irreversible fusion of the interior and the Nile, was the single event that made the eventual, total destruction of the Crusader states a mathematical certainty, and the Templars, who were the grim, unsentimental military mathematicians of the Latin East, could read the final, fatal equation with a terrible, precise, and ice-cold clarity that left no room for hope or self-deception. The long war against Nur ad-Din had been a war of grinding, exhausting attrition. The coming war against Saladin, the war that was now clearly and unavoidably on the horizon, would be a war of total, merciless annihilation, and the Templars were the only force remaining in the entire kingdom that was fully prepared, psychologically, militarily, and spiritually, for the final, apocalyptic battle. The death of Nur ad-Din in the spring of 1174 and the subsequent, rapid, and brilliantly opportunistic rise of Saladin to the sole, unchallenged mastery of the entire Muslim empire was a transition that the Templars, who had been studying their enemies with the cold, analytical eye of the professional soldier for decades, had long anticipated and had, in their own strange, inverted way, deeply respected, for they recognized in Saladin a commander who combined all the dangerous qualities of his master with a charisma and a flexibility that were entirely his own. The old atabeg had been a known, familiar, and therefore in some sense predictable enemy, a commander whose strategic methods, whose tactical preferences, and whose political calculations had been painfully learned and internalized through decades of hard, direct experience. Saladin was an unknown, and unpredictable, and therefore a profoundly dangerous new quantity, a ruler who combined the intense, burning ideological fervor of Nur ad-Din with a dazzling personal charisma, a remarkable political flexibility, and a gift for the grand, dramatic gesture that the older, more austere man had never possessed or desired. A combination that made him far more dangerous to the Franks than his master had ever been. The Templar High Command, now led by the forceful, aggressive, and controversial Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, assessed the new Sultan with a wary, calculating, and professionally respectful eye, recognizing immediately that the vast Muslim empire, which had been held together for a generation by the sheer iron will and the personal sanctity of Nur ad-Din, was now being held together by the brilliant, ambitious, and potentially far more dangerous will of his successor. The war that was coming, the great, final war that would decide the earthly fate of the holy city of Jerusalem, was shaping up to be a war between the two most effective, the most disciplined, and the most ideologically committed military institutions of the entire age, the Templar Order and the Ayyubid army, and the outcome of that war would determine the fate of the holy places for centuries to come. The internal politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the critical years after Nur ad-Din's death were a vertiginous, sickening, and apparently irreversible descent into a chaos of faction, disease, and open civil war that the Templars, who were themselves increasingly drawn into the toxic maelstrom, watched with a mounting, helpless, and deeply frustrated fury. The final, apocalyptic, and world-historical Battle of the Horns of Hattin, fought on the 4th day of July in the year 1187, was the culmination, the terrible and logical end result, of the entire 40-year strategic process that Nur ad-Din had so brilliantly initiated and that Saladin had so skillfully, and in some sense inevitably, completed. The Crusader army, the largest field force that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled, led by the hapless and strategically outmatched King Guy de Lusignan and accompanied by the most sacred relic in all Christendom, the fragment of the true cross upon which the Savior had died, marched out of the well-watered springs of Syria into the waterless, burning, and utterly exposed plain of the Horns of Hattin. A march that was the direct, lineal descendant of every fatal blunder that the Crusader leadership had committed since the debacle at Damascus 40 years earlier. This fatal march, the decision to abandon the water and to lead the entire army into a desert death trap, was the direct, lineal, and ghostly descendant of the original, catastrophic march from the western orchards to the eastern plain of Damascus in 1148, the fatal blunder that had destroyed the Second Crusade and that had, in the cruelest of ironies, created the very conditions for Nur ad-Din's rise. The army was surrounded, its access to the life-giving water of Lake Tiberias systematically blocked by Saladin's forces, and the Muslim horse archers began the slow, methodical, and utterly devastating process of attrition that the Templars had been fighting against, alone and outnumbered, for 40 long years, a process that was as remorseless as the desert sun and as inevitable as the tide. The Templars and the Hospitallers, the iron core of the Crusader defense, formed their traditional, disciplined infantry formations, the unbreakable shield walls and the massed crossbow lines, and fought with the cold, desperate, and magnificent discipline that had been drilled into them by the sacred rule and by the decades of unrelenting frontier war. But the discipline of the military orders, no matter how heroic or how superhuman, could not ultimately save an army that had been led into a waterless trap by a divided, incompetent, and deeply compromised command, a command that had squandered every advantage and that had handed Saladin a victory that he could never have won against a properly led and properly supplied Frankish army. The execution of the captured Templars and Hospitallers after the Battle of Hattin, an act of deliberate, calculated, and symbolic violence that Saladin ordered personally and that was carried out in front of the assembled Muslim army, was a profound and terrible recognition of the special, hated, and deeply respected status that the military orders held in the collective Muslim mind. The Sultan, who had studied his enemies for his entire adult life with the same cold, analytical, and professionally respectful eye that the Templars had studied him, understood with perfect clarity that the warrior monks, with their iron discipline, their unquestioning obedience, and their absolute, fanatical commitment to the cause, were by far the most dangerous and the most irreplaceable fighters in the entire Crusader army, and that their elimination was a strategic necessity of the first order. The secular knights and the ordinary soldiers who were captured at Hattin were, for the most part, eventually ransomed back to their families or sold into the slave markets of Cairo and Damascus, their lives spared according to the normal, pragmatic customs of medieval warfare. But the Templars and the Hospitallers, the brothers of the white mantle and the black, were systematically and deliberately executed, their throats cut one by the Sufi mystics and the religious scholars who had eagerly, fervently volunteered for the holy and meritorious task. A task that was seen as a direct continuation of the Jihad that Nur ad-Din had preached and that Saladin was now implementing with terrible, methodical precision. The execution of the Templars was not a mere act of military expediency. It was a ritual, a sacrifice, a profoundly symbolic act of ideological war that was the final, bitter, and entirely logical fruit of the jihadist ideology that Nur ad-Din had so carefully cultivated over a lifetime. The warrior monks, who had been the saviors of the French king at Mount Cadmus and the faithful, unyielding guardians of the pilgrim roads for 2 generations, died with the same cold, stoic, and magnificent courage with which they had lived, their last words a prayer to the God they had served and a curse upon the enemy who was about to destroy the kingdom they had died to defend. The fall of Jerusalem, which occurred on the 2nd day of October in the year 1187, was the final, symbolic, and world-shattering end of the Crusader kingdom that Nur ad-Din had spent his entire adult life working, with such patience and such genius, to destroy. The Holy City, which had been in Frankish hands for 88 years, surrendered to Saladin after a brief but intense siege, its tiny, demoralized garrison far too small to defend the miles of ancient walls and its exhausted, terrified population far too demoralized to mount any kind of effective resistance. A population that had been abandoned by the kings and the barons whose greed and folly had brought the kingdom to this final, catastrophic pass. The Sultan, who had been raised from his childhood on the horrific, traumatic stories of the Frankish conquest of 1099 and the indiscriminate massacre of the entire Muslim population of the city, chose, in a display of calculated, politically brilliant, and deeply impressive mercy, to spare the Christian inhabitants, allowing them to ransom themselves and their families and to depart from the city in peace and with their movable property. The stark, dramatic, and universally remarked contrast between the magnanimous mercy of Saladin and the bloodthirsty, genocidal atrocity of the First Crusade was a propaganda triumph of the very highest order, a powerful, resonant demonstration to the entire watching world that the Jihad was not a war of mindless, barbaric extermination but a war of liberation. A sacred restoration of the true faith to the holy places, a restoration that was as much a testament to the ideological legacy of Nur ad-Din as any military victory. The Templars, who had evacuated their great fortress of the Temple in Jerusalem before the final surrender, retreated to the coastal cities, their white mantles stained with the dust and the blood of the lost kingdom and their hearts filled with a cold, implacable, and unbreakable determination to continue the fight. The legacy of Nur ad-Din, the atabeg of Aleppo who had revived the long-dormant Jihad and who had, through a lifetime of patient and brilliant labor, unified Syria into a single, cohesive, and ideologically mobilized empire, is a legacy that is, in the popular historical imagination, often overshadowed and obscured by the more famous, more glamorous, and more romantic figure of Saladin. But it is, in the cold, hard, and unsentimental analysis of the professional strategist, the far more important and the far more foundational of the two, for it was Nur ad-Din who built the machine that Saladin drove, who revived the ideology that Saladin wielded, and who created the strategic conditions that made Saladin's victory not only possible but, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Saladin was the executor, the brilliant, charismatic, and brilliantly successful general who wielded the sword that his master had forged. Nur ad-Din was the original architect, the patient, methodical, and visionary builder of the entire ideological, political, and military infrastructure that made Saladin's world-changing victories possible, the man who had spent a quarter of a century laying the foundations upon which his more famous successor would construct his legend. The unification of Syria, the abolition of the ancient Fatimid schism, the construction of the vast network of madrasas and mosques, the creation of the professional, standing Mamluk army, and the establishment of the Jihad as the central, defining, and all-consuming project of the Islamic State were all, without exception, the work of the atabeg. The life's work of a man who had dedicated every waking hour and every ounce of his formidable energy to the single, consuming, and sacred purpose of expelling the Franks from the holy places. The long, dark shadow of Nur ad-Din stretches across the entire subsequent history of the Crusades, a shadow that falls upon the blood-soaked walls of Hattin and the merciful gates of Jerusalem, and the story of the Crusader kingdom's final, tragic destruction is, in the deepest and most fundamental analysis, the story of his slow, patient, inexorable, and posthumous triumph over the enemies he had hated with such a pure and consuming fire. The Templar response to the catastrophic, world-shattering fall of Jerusalem was a strategic withdrawal to the remaining coastal cities, a rapid, professional consolidation of the order's surviving resources, and a cold, clear-eyed, and utterly determined preparation for the long, grinding war of reconquest that would define the entire next century of crusading history. The order, which had lost its most sacred and its most symbolically central charge, the physical protection of the Holy Sepulchre, did not dissolve into despair, did not surrender to the apparently triumphant enemy, and did not abandon the cause for which so many of its brothers had died, for the Templar spirit was not so easily broken. It reorganized, rebuilt, and rearmed with a speed and an efficiency that astonished its allies and its enemies alike, its preceptories across the face of Europe redoubling their urgent efforts to send every available man, every spare coin of silver, and every shipment of weapons and supplies to the beleaguered remnants of the Latin East. The Templar fleet, which had been the effective navy of the Crusader states for decades, became the essential instrument of a new, maritime-based strategy, a war of coastal raids, of blockades, and of the slow, painful economic strangulation that would eventually, over the course of a century, wear down the vast but internally fragile Ayyubid Empire, a strategy that was the direct descendant of the patient, methodical approach to war that Nur ad-Din himself had perfected. The Templar spirit, the iron discipline, the monastic self-sacrifice, and the unshakable, almost supernatural courage that had been originally forged on the frozen, blood-slicked slopes of Mount Cadmus and then tested to the absolute breaking point on the long, burning frontiers of the Jihad, survived the military disaster of Hattin and the spiritual catastrophe of the fall of the Holy City. The white mantles of the Order, stained with the dust of 100 lost battles but still blazing with an inner, spiritual light, remained the symbol of an unbroken, unbreakable, and eternally defiant resistance, a resistance that would continue for another century until the Order itself was destroyed not by the Muslims, but by a Christian king. We have traced, across the span of a generation, the rise of the first true and worthy nemesis of the Templar Order, the pious, iron-willed, and strategically brilliant Prince of Aleppo who understood, as no Muslim ruler before him had ever fully understood, that the existential war against the Franks could not possibly be won by the sword alone, that it must be won, first and decisively, in the hearts, the minds, and the souls of the faithful. We have followed the construction of the jihadist state, the patient, decades-long campaign of propaganda, education, and political unification that transformed the fragmented, demoralized, and mutually hostile Muslim world into a single, cohesive, ideologically mobilized, and militarily formidable empire. An empire that would outlast the Crusader states, and that would reshape the history of the entire region. We have seen how the Crusader states, trapped in their feudal chaos, their political self-destruction, and their deep, incurable cultural isolation, were slowly, inexorably encircled, isolated, and strangled by the strategic genius of the atabeg. The story of Nur ad-Din is not as famous, not as widely celebrated, and not as romantic as the story of Saladin, but it is, in the deep, structural, and strategic sense, the more important story by far, the story of the man who built the magnificent and terrible machine that Saladin drove to victory, the man who revived the Jihad and who sealed the ultimate fate of the Crusader kingdom. The white mantles of the Templars, the iron discipline that had saved a king at Mount Cadmus, could hold the line against the rising tide of the Jihad for a generation of heroic, unremitting sacrifice. But they could not hold it forever, and the fall of Jerusalem was the final, tragic, and in some deep sense inevitable conclusion of the long war that Nur ad-Din had started. If this story of ideological war, of strategic patience, and of the forgotten titan who reshaped the destiny of the medieval world has opened your eyes and fired your imagination, let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Your likes, your shares, and your subscriptions are the vital fuel that drives this channel forward and that allows us to continue bringing you these deep, immersive dives into the epic of the Crusades, and ringing the notification bell guarantees you a front row seat for every new journey into the forgotten battlefields of history. Every single like brings us nearer to that 1,000-like goal, so press that button decisively if you believe that the architects of history, the patient builders and the quiet strategists, deserve to be remembered and honored alongside the famous conquerors and the glamorous heroes. Share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who craves the deep, complex, and often uncomfortable truths that lie behind the simplified legends, and help us build a community of those who refuse to let the past be buried under the accumulating dust of time. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.